I guess I'll gavel in the round table. First of all, thank you all for taking the time to come to participate in this round table, for your thoughtful testimony. I've read all of it. I've read some of it a couple of times. I've reached out to a couple of you too as well to try and do some summaries as well. So because we have so many participants, normally we'd offer about 5 minutes worth of opening statements, but I think what we want to do is keep it to 2 minutes. So be thinking right now about the top priorities of the points you wanted to make in this roundtable. And then I told my staff to keep my time open. I know one participant's going to have to catch a flight, but I'm going to sit here until my questions are answered, until my curiosity is satiated. I would ask that my opening statement be entered in the record. The only thing the only point I want to make is I've been working on this issue now for probably 6 years. And the level of frustration is hard to describe. The threats I believe this nation faces with any kind of high-altitude nuclear explosion causing an EMP or a high-intensity solar storm in terms of GMD, and the threat that poses to our infrastructure and literally our very way of life is just hard to overstate. I think certainly before I really started delving into this, I was like most Americans, either largely unaware or I kind of heard about this and it's just science fiction. I mean, that would never happen. We're not going to see Mad Max and Thunderdome, okay? The frustration is there's such a broad spectrum of opinion here. I'm not an electrical engineer. I'm not a technical expert on this. I'm an accountant. I'm a business guy. But I've had that process of solving problems, which is gathering information, doing root cause analysis, properly defining the problem, trying to establish achievable goals. What drives me nuts about this is nobody agrees on the information. You've got really smart people, and there's a broad spectrum. So what I find interesting about this roundtable is I think we've got some really good testimony. I think we can zero in on some action items so that we can hopefully establish some achievable goals. And by the way, I'm talking about actionable, achievable goals. We have for far too long talked about developing a strategy, to develop a plan. Hey, let's do more research. And we just elongate the time period before we actually start doing something concrete to start mitigating what could be a horrific catastrophe. I never want to be sitting here in the dark saying I told you so. I want to start taking action as quickly as possible, and I want to thank Senator Peters, Senator Rosen for showing up. I think Senator Toomey, not on our committee. I want to thank Senator Murkowski. Most of the law that we'd have to write would probably come under her jurisdiction. And so I hope her staff is here. We've got to work together collaboratively on this thing. We've got to find the areas of agreement to address what, again, would just be a cataclysmic type of event, either space weather or the growing threats from some of these rogue states that have probably the capability of detonating something that could, again, cause a lot of harm. So with that, I'll shut up, turn it over to Senator Peters before we let all of you go through. And we'll just go around the table, ask you to state your name, what your organizations that you're representing, and then just kind of hit your high points. And then it's going to be a free-for-all. I mean, we're not going to do this normally where it's 7 minutes or whatever. We'll just, because otherwise it becomes too disjointed. I want to be able to follow a line of questioning, the points being made in somewhat logical order. But with that, Senator Peters.
Well, thank you, Chairman Johnson. I'll be brief as well, so we can get to hearing the testimony here. I couldn't agree more with Chairman Johnson that this is a topic that we need to explore. I've been focused on one aspect of that, which are the GMDs, which, if you look at whether or not we'd have an EMT or a GMD event, the one thing about GMD, I think it's not a question of if, it's just when. We know they have occurred. We know that they have been significant in the past, but they existed before we were all interconnected in the internet and with elaborate grids. It'll be, if we have another event like Carrington in the 1850s, it'll be much different today than it was back then. And I know Dr. Casper will be talking about that. I've worked with Dr. Casper on this issue for a while, and my friends at the University of Michigan in the heliophysics department and other have been big big advocates for doing something and actually having action, that we can't just sit back and not look at this. This is something that will come eventually, and it could be absolutely catastrophic if we're not prepared for that. So in order for us to move forward, though, we have to get everybody on the same page. We have to make sure we all agree on what the facts are, and we all agree on the risk associated with GMD events, GMD events, or other events, and then we can write some meaningful legislation. I did write legislation in the past, the Space Weather Research and Forecasting Act. It's now passed the Senate twice, which is great. Hasn't passed the House, unfortunately. In this place, you need to have both. And we're hoping that what we get out of this hearing will give us some further momentum to get that act first. That bill is not the end all, but it gets us on a track where we can start coordinating activities between all of the various government agencies and making sure that data is being provided to those who need to see the data as a result of solar activity. So it's a meaningful step forward, but we've got to do a whole lot more. But in order to get there, the opinions and the facts and the counsel we get from all of you here is going to be absolutely critical. So thank you for being here today. I look forward to a good discussion.
So we'll start with Karen Evans. She's currently serves as the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response to the U.S. Department of Energy. We've got a little 2-minute timer, and just try. Pardon? You're ready. Okay. I got the gavel.
Okay. So thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member Peters and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the risks posed. DOE's role in addressing energy sector risks and energy sector security is well established. From the department's role in nuclear security through the National Nuclear Security Administration to the groundbreaking grid modernization research at our national laboratories, DOE has the expertise and the relationships to support the energy sector and to help protect its critical infrastructure in coordination with the department. I'd like to highlight just a few of our ongoing projects in this area, which include improving unclassified E3 waveforms, code and databases to be able to share EMP effects with our partners, enhancing the nation's EMP and GMD capabilities through CSMART, which is the Center for EMP and GMD Simulation, Modeling, Analysis, Research, and Testing, implementing a pilot project to field deploy and evaluate technologies to mitigate the effects of GMD and the E3 from the EMP on the electric grid. We also plan to develop a hardening and resilience roadmap this year, specifying what we can and should be doing, working with our industry partners with available resources to deploy technologies to protect critical components, equipment, and systems on the electric grid from EMP and GMD effects and impacts. DOE is fully committed to help forging the grid of the future that will be more resilient to all hazards, including EMP and GMD. Continued progress in the grid modernization is vital to help us protect the grid from these impacts. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here with the committee to discuss the effects of this and participate in the roundtable, and I applaud your leadership in this area.
Thank you, Ms. Evans. You've set a good example for everybody else. Next witness is Brian Harrell, currently serves as the Assistant Director of Infrastructure Security Division at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Harrell.
Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the committee, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Department of Homeland Security's ongoing efforts to secure our nation's critical infrastructure against threats from electromagnetic pulse and geomagnetic disturbances. As a short introduction, I am the Assistant Director for Infrastructure Security within the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency within DHS. I want to thank you all for your leadership in passing the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency Act of 2018. I appreciate the interest of this committee on getting to the facts regarding threats from EMP and GMD. While I'm new to my current role, I previously served as the Managing Director of Enterprise Security at Duke Energy. I'm also the former Director of Critical Infrastructure Protection at the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. So I'm very, very familiar with the risk management conversation we are discussing today. The effects of nuclear EMP and GMD on critical infrastructure are related, but the threat space is very different and should be discussed separately. Regarding the threat landscape for nuclear EMP, work completed by the intelligence community and the nuclear weapons community provides specific and periodic assessment of the nuclear weapons capabilities of foreign countries, including the capabilities to generate an EMP. The intelligence community currently has no specific, credible information indicating that there is an imminent threat to critical infrastructure from an EMP attack. However, the consequences of a successful nuclear EMP attack using a nuclear weapon detonated at high altitude are potentially severe and may include long-term damage to significant portions of the nation's power grid and communications infrastructure. Under the joint DHS-DOE funding, the United States Nuclear Weapons Laboratories have completed a preliminary nuclear EMP impacts assessment on the nation's electric power system. This study developed a spectrum of EMP attack scenarios and estimates of impacts. Although additional work is required, this study provides the basis for more advanced risk assessments in the electric sector and a framework for risk assessments in other sectors. DHS, in collaboration with interagency partners, is working to provide owners and operators of critical infrastructure with the resulting information frameworks to help them manage risks from electromagnetic events. Regarding the threats landscape from GMD.
So again, I have to discipline this. So we have your written testimony. We can read that. I want to move on. I want to keep people, again, you don't have to necessarily read these things. You can, off the top of your head, you know the subject matter. Give us the primary points of what you're coming here to testify about. So our next participant will be Nathan Anderson. He's the Acting Director of the Homeland Security and Justice Team at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Mr. Anderson.
Thank you. Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, members of the committee. Since 2016, we have issued several reports reviewing federal agency actions to address electromagnetic risks. First, we found in 2016 that DHS, DOE, and FERC had taken actions such as establishing industry standards and federal guidelines and completing EMP-related research. We found that their actions aligned with some of the EMP Commission recommendations. We also found that opportunities existed to enhance federal efforts to coordinate and address electromagnetic risks to the grid and made several recommendations, most of which have been implemented. Second, we reported that electricity suppliers had identified information on GMD and HEMP effects on the grid, and most suppliers we interviewed had taken some steps to protect against GMD effects. U.S. and Canadian suppliers have identified information on the potential effects of a severe GMD resulting from a solar storm, but have identified less information about the potential effects of HEMP events. Suppliers we interviewed also described the range of costs incurred to protect against GMD and HEMP, which can range from minimal costs to 20% of such projects' costs. We also reported on technologies that are available or in development that could help prevent or mitigate the effects of GMDs on the grid. They hold promise but are not ready for widespread operational deployment. Finally, we found that efforts are underway to address the likelihood of a large-scale GMD, the risks such storms pose, and potential mitigation measures which will help inform whether additional actions are needed to prevent or mitigate the effects of GMDs on the grid. Regarding EMP events, we found more research is needed to fully investigate and evaluate how an electric utility could protect itself from or mitigate the effects of EMP on its system. This concludes my statement.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Our next participant is Joseph McClelland, is the Director of the Office of Energy Infrastructure Security at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, commonly known as FERC. Mr. McClelland.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson and Ranking Member Peters, for your leadership and interest in this subject, and with the invitation to this roundtable discussion today. I am here today as a member of the Commission staff, and my remarks do not necessarily represent the views of the Commission or any individual commissioners. The Commission's authorities to oversee the development of mandatory standards to protect the reliability of the bulk power system fall under the Federal Power Act. Under this authority, FERC cannot author or modify reliability standards, but must depend upon an electric reliability organization to perform this task. The Commission certified the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, as the ERO. The ERO develops and proposes new reliability standards or modifications to existing standards with industry for the Commission's review, which can then either approve or remand. However, the consequences of a severe and naturally occurring event or national security threat by entities intent on attacking the United States by exploiting its vulnerabilities in its electric grid or using physical or cyber means stands in stark contrast to major reliability events that have caused regional blackouts and reliability failures in the past. Widespread disruption of electric service can undermine the security of the United States government, its military, the economy, as well as endanger the health and safety of its citizens. Given the national security dimension to this threat, it is imperative that action be taken quickly and effectively to protect America's infrastructure. For these reasons, the Commission uses a dual-fold approach, employing both mandatory standards to establish foundational practices, while also working collaboratively with industry, the states, and federal agencies to identify and promote best practices to mitigate advanced threats. Because EMP and GMD events pose a serious threat to the electric grid and its supporting infrastructures that serve our nation, the Commission has found it necessary to use both standards and a collaborative approach to address these threats, as is detailed in my written testimony. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. By the way, we don't have to restate the fact that this could be catastrophic. We've both said it twice. Okay. So focus in on new information that, in particular, your agency or the people you're representing. What are the main points? So our next participant is Dr. George Baker. Dr. Baker is currently a professor emeritus at James Madison University. He previously served as the senior advisor to the former commission to assess the threat to the United States from an electromagnetic pulse attack, which is normally called the EMP Commission. Dr. Baker.
So again, thanks for this opportunity and for holding this roundtable. I think it's very, very, very important.
I would recommend everybody get the mic a little bit
Closer. All right. Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you. So my watchword is defense conservative. We need to be defense conservative in everything we do, and the problem I see, that's not happening. Okay. I have a long list of recommended actions. I'll go down these and stop me in mid-course if you want. But so I have top-down recommendations, things that need to happen from the federal level down, and then bottom up from the local, state level up. I'd say the most important recommendation of the Congressional EMP Commission was that we need an Office of EMP Coordination within the National Security Council, and I'm told that's actually part of the executive order that should come out soon. The FERC GMD standard, number TPL 007-2, though its specified environments and system thresholds are not defense conservative, has at least brought industry attention to GMD. This standard, even if rigorously enforced, will leave the grid dangerously vulnerable to GMD and needs to be revised. Without a corresponding FERC EMP directive, the private sector is not doing very much of anything on the EMP front. New legislation is needed to empower FERC, specifically to be able to write and enforce grid protection standards, and secondly, to identify mechanisms, including cost recovery measures, to incentivize the private sector. A national EMP protection standard is needed. DHS is to be commended for issuing a coordination version of a protection standard, but that needs to become official and expanded to address not just comm centers, but the electric grid itself. For more than half a century, DoD has protected high-priority military command control communication computer assets for nuclear deterrence. DHS and DOE programs need to emulate what DoD is doing, their methods. We need to preclude the temptation to reinvent the wheel by giving DHS and DOE full access to the DoD standards and databases. There's no need to recalculate a standard EMP waveform. And
Okay, and listen, I understand that this is not easy to do, okay? And so I apologize for that, but I really wanted to get to the discussion phase as quickly as possible. What I will say about Dr. Baker's testimony is I did call him up, was it yesterday or 2 days ago? Because reading through his testimony, I saw what I have not seen in about 6 years of doing this, actual action items. So I asked him to prioritize that. He was going through that list. I would kind of like to use that list, because you've all got the testimony, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you have that priority list of Dr. Baker? I would suggest as we continue this discussion, again, we'll go through all the opening statements, but when we turn to questions, I'd recommend to the senators, and I'd also recommend to the panelists to take a look at that priority list, because it's actual action items, the things that we should be doing from a top-down approach, from what the federal government has to do, versus a bottom-up approach, local utilities, local governments, that type of thing. So again, I thought it was just very well organized, and I think it's a good way for us to organize our discussion kind of around, basically the action items that Dr. Baker put in his testimony. So again, I apologize for cutting you off, but we will get to these lists, and I think in good detail. And what I want to ferret out from this is, what do we agree on? Where's there dispute? What maybe doesn't industry agree with versus what does government agree on. You know, I want to get this fleshed out, so we can actually move forward with some real action items. But having said that, our next participant is Scott Aronson. He's Vice President for Security and Preparedness at Edison Electric Institute. Mr. Aronson.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the committee. As you said, my name is Scott Aronson, Vice President for Security and Preparedness at EEI. EEI represents all of the nation's investor-owned electric companies. Our members operate in all 50 states and the District of Columbia and serve more than 70% of all electricity customers in the United States. EEI appreciates your leadership in convening this roundtable, and I look forward to discussing the electric power industry's work to protect against both electromagnetic pulses and geomagnetic disturbances. My written testimony goes into further detail about industry's efforts to address threats posed by EMPs, but for the purposes of open comments, I want to address three important themes. First, we take all threats to our infrastructure seriously. Whether preparing for natural hazards or malicious acts, EEI's members are committed to protecting the communities they serve. Ensuring we provide a reliable product is our business, so we have every incentive to protect our systems. Second, when it comes to issues of national security, the electric power industry recognizes its role in protecting the lives and safety of our customers. We also recognize that with intelligent adversaries and an evolving threat landscape, partnering with federal, state, and local government is paramount. In fact, the President's National Infrastructure Advisory Council, or NIAC, called the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council and the electric sector the model for government industry coordination. While we're exceedingly proud of that designation and working with our partners at DOE and DHS, we are also striving to improve the industry's preparedness against all hazards by leveraging both industry and government capabilities. Finally, we agree that both EMP and GMD pose threats to the reliable operation of the energy grid and therefore to the economic and national security of the nation. To the extent that policy changes are necessary, we look forward to working with all the committees of jurisdiction and our partners at DOE, DHS, DOD, FERC, and throughout the federal government. But sound policy must be based on sound science. And it is for that reason that we appreciate the work of the Electric Power Research Institute and the North American Electric Liability Corporation, which informs industry as we pursue the right investments and operating posture to appropriately protect the energy grid. Thank you again for this opportunity. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Aronson. So we'll now turn to Randy Horton. He is the Senior Program Manager for Grid Operations and Planning at the Electric Power Research Institute. Mr. Horton.
Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. My name is Randy Horton, and I'm a Senior Program Manager at the Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI. EPRI takes electromagnetic threats seriously and has conducted extensive research to improve understanding of the potential impacts that high-altitude EMP and GMD events can have on the electric grid. As an example, EPRI launched a focused research effort in April 2016 to evaluate the potential impacts of a high-altitude EMP attack on the U.S. electric grid and to identify and test options for mitigating those potential impacts. Currently, there are more than 60 U.S. utilities participating in this research project. Using various unclassified or bounding high-altitude EMP environments, including those provided by DOE and Los Alamos, we have evaluated the potential impacts of high-altitude EMP on the electric transmission system. Additionally, we have evaluated and tested several options for mitigating impacts that were identified. A final report of this research, including assessment results and mitigation options, is expected to be made available on April 30th of this year. A key to our success has been our close collaboration with subject matter experts at the DOE, the 3 DOE weapons labs, and the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. The sharing of knowledge and information that has occurred over the 3-year period has been very valuable to our research and also to the industry. GMD is also concerned for the bulk power system, and over the last 4 decades, EPRI has been a leader in this area. We're currently performing research to improve industry's ability to predict and mitigate the potential impacts of a severe GMD event, and the results of this research may be used to inform future revisions of NERC GMD standards. In closing, EPRI is committed to developing science-based solutions to these complex problems and will continue to offer technical leadership and support to the electricity sector, public policymakers, and other stakeholders. Thank you for your time. That concludes my testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Horton. Our next participant is David Roop. He is the Director for Electric Transmission Operations and Reliability at Dominion Energy. Mr. Roop.
Good afternoon, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the committee. I'm the Director of Electric Transmission Operations and Reliability at Dominion Energy. My company very much appreciates the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. Dominion Energy is headquartered in Richmond, Virginia, and provides electricity or natural gas to 7.5 million homes and businesses across 18 states. The service area for our regulated utility, Dominion Energy Virginia, is in close proximity to the District of Columbia and includes many vital national security and defense operations. We also provide electricity to a large percentage of the internet traffic in the world. During my 43 years with Dominion Energy, my focus has been on electric transmission and substation operations. At Dominion Energy, we consider all hazards, man-made or acts of man, as well as naturally occurring events, in both our planning and operations. Protecting our system for GMD and EMP is part of that mission. Over the many decades, we've hardened our substation components to better enable them to survive the impact of GMD events. This hardening has occurred as we upgrade or replace equipment at the end of a life. Over the course of many years, Dominion Energy has made investments and developed contingency plans to improve the resiliency of our network when confronted with EMP events. Making these simple changes has also improved our day-to-day operations for challenges such as lightning and transients. But we now have come to a point that requires additional research to guide our future efforts to improve system resiliency for EMP events. This research is extremely important in helping us to make prudent investments. The tremendous support of our federal partners has allowed us to get to the point we are today. This assistance has really improved our knowledge, and we're grateful for it. I ask the U.S. government to continue this effort to get us across this next few research areas. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Mr. Roop. Our next participant is James Vespolik.
Vespolik.
Close.
Close enough.
I never hit even 50% getting him right. Mr. Vespolik is the Director for Asset Planning and Engineering at the American Transmission Company, headquartered in Waukesha, Wisconsin. Mr. Vespolik.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the committee. I'm with ATC, or American Transmission Company, as was mentioned. We were formed in January 2001 as a transmission-only utility. We operate 9,600 miles of transmission lines and about assets in about 560 substations in portions of Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and Illinois. We don't own generation, and we don't have load-serving customers. We serve other utilities that serve the load. We've been active in many different industry organizations, such as EPRI and North American Transmission Forum and others, where we monitor the research and follow the steps that are being taken in the industry, trying to identify prudent steps that we can take to monitor or mitigate these risks. I think one of the reasons I'm here is in 2015, ATC purchased the first commercially available transformer neutral insertion device and installed it in one of our substations. We found a substation that was ideal for that device, and we installed that prototype, which is meant to automatically protect the transformer from harmful geomagnetic-induced currents. To my knowledge, it's the only one currently installed and operational in the industry. We set the threshold on it very low so that we could get a lot of operations on it and get some experience with it. So far, it's operated dozens of times and has performed as designed. It's not meant to be done without forethought to just put one in. You need to do a little bit of thinking and studying of the transmission network so you can fully understand what the impacts might be. We take many other steps, defense in depth approach, as highlighted in my statements. Sharing information like we are doing today and some of the research that's going on at like EPRI are critical for tackling this issue and finding prudent, effective decisions to make.
Our next participant is Justin Casper. Mr. Casper is an Associate Professor of Space Science and Engineering at the University of Michigan. Mr. Casper.
Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to discuss with you what we know about the solar origin of geomagnetic disturbances and how we can improve our ability to predict their occurrence. The famous Carrington event of 1859 started with a visible flare on the sun, and then 18 hours later a magnetic tsunami engulfed Earth, sending compasses spinning, bringing the northern lights down to the Caribbean, making telegraph lines spark. We might not rely on telegraph today, but our power lines are equally susceptible. The risk from these events is real, and unfortunately the Carrington event wasn't some unique event. On July 23rd of 2012, for instance, a spacecraft operating on the other side of the sun was immersed in a similar eruption that would have hit Earth square on if it had happened just 9 days sooner. Multiple researchers estimate the probability of a similar event happening in any one decade at between 3 and 10%. Now, I'd also like to stress that in addition to these extreme events, smaller but more frequent GMD also have a significant cumulative impact. For example, commercial insurance claims for damaged electronics spike around 20% during periods of heightened geomagnetic activity. This translates to an average of $10 billion in damage each year in the U.S. So if we could address those major GMDs, we might also be able to protect ourselves from those smaller events. And what can we do about this? Well, right now, telescopes detect an eruption at the sun, and we make a forecast. We don't have any confirmation until it reaches the NOAA Discover spacecraft. Now, any warning is better than none, but an extreme event would get from that spacecraft to Earth in less than 10 minutes. And this is not enough time to assess the risk and recommend action. We need spacecraft closer to the sun providing earlier warning of Earth-directed events and their properties, better models of those eruptions, and regional forecasts of GMDs. Most importantly, I think we need leadership with the authority to coordinate and direct the research and operational components of space weather that are spread now over multiple agencies.
Thank you, Mr. Casper. Our final participant is Caitlin Durkovich. Ms. Durkovich is currently a director at Toffler Associates and previously served as the Assistant Secretary of Infrastructure Protection at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Ms. Durkovich.
Good afternoon, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today on protecting the electric grid from an EMP or GMD, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. In addition to having served as the Assistant Secretary for Infrastructure Protection, I also co-chaired the Space Weather Operations Research and Mitigation, or SWARM, task force, which produced the National Space Weather Strategy and Action Plan in 2016. There is no doubt the risk facing our critical infrastructure has grown. We are reliant on aging infrastructures that increasingly leverage data and technology to enable more efficient, reliable, and distributed operations. This highly interconnected, electrified, and digitized ecosystem is not only being used for purposes we never could have imagined when it was built a century ago, but it must be resilient to risks, as Senator Peters said, that we never could have imagined or fully appreciated 100 years ago. What is encouraging is the partnership and coordination between government and industry, which owns most of our nation's critical infrastructure. It has matured, and it is providing more visibility into emergent threat vectors and potential consequences, guiding joint action on risk mitigation. The ESCC is one such example. The SWARM Task Force is another. DHS's strategy for protecting and preparing the homeland against threats of EMP and GMD is another. The strategy's three goals are practical steps the critical infrastructure community can coalesce around. I do agree with DHS's assessment about the potential severity of both the direct and indirect impacts of an EMP or GMD incident, and that it should compel our national attention. One of the biggest challenges I believe we face is risk awareness and sustained focus on this hard problem. Lower probability, high consequence threats are overshadowed by real-time threats that require 24/7 attention, such as cyber attacks. I believe that we can take a page from hurricane preparedness to help improve action around this important issue, and I look forward to talking to you about it over the course of the next several hours. So thank you very much, and I think we can get to the heart of the matter now.
Let's get to it. So normally what ends up happening in these Senate types of hearings is we go down a list and we each get 5 minutes or 7 minutes, and that works fine, but we end up with a pretty disjointed conversation from my standpoint. So what I want is a little bit more of a free-for-all. I expect senators to be pretty respectful of each other. We'll chime in. But what I would like is there's so many of you, if you want to chime in on a particular topic or question, just put your name tag like that, and we'll try and get to you sort of in the order that you've done that. I will just quick start out the line of questioning. Kind of getting back to what I was saying in my opening statement, I heard, and don't take offense by this, I heard a number of you talk about we take this very seriously. Okay, I mean, good. We have to. Mm-hmm. What have we done about it? We've known about this since at least, GMD, Carrington effect, in terms of high altitude nuclear blasts since the early 60s. We have in our military institutions, by the way, when I was interviewing General Kelly for Secretary of Homeland Security, I asked him about his understanding of the threat of EMP and does he take it seriously? Because we've had people on this committee say it's hokum. So I asked General Kelly, I said, what's your evaluation of this? Is this going to be a top priority of you as a secretary? He said, well, Senator, I'm not a technologist, but I do know in the Defense Department we spent billions of dollars hardening our defense assets. I think part of Dr. Baker's testimony is that we have the military spec for this. We've known about this. We aren't doing high-altitude nuclear tests, so we don't have the specific information on current electronics, but we have standards now. I want to start out with Mr. McClendon, with FERC, just kind of asking, FERC did establish a spec for GMD. Why didn't we establish a spec for EMP? And according to Dr. Baker's testimony, I don't want to throw you under the bus there, Dr. Baker, but the GMD spec is set too low, at too low intensity, and we're assuming the survivability of these transformers and equipment is just too high. So can you explain what happened with FERC? Because that's certainly one of the recommendations of Dr. Baker is we have to establish a higher standard for GMD and we have to establish standards for EMP or the industry won't do anything, and I don't blame them because they've got no direction. But please.
To that point, we've been discussing this and been before panels multiple times. And we've said in the open, I know I've said it under testimony, that the NERC standards development process is a consensus-based process with industry. FERC can't write or author the standards. It can't conduct research, and it's done that. So in 2010, it, with DOE and DHS, sponsored extensive studies on GMD, EMP, and IMI as a basis for further action. It then, sua sponte, or on its own motion, directed NERC to develop a GMD standard. That was after there was significant contentious discussions between subject matter experts and industry, and the argument went like this. If the grid collapses, first of all, FERC came out with a study with the Oak Ridge National Lab, with DHS and DOE. It said that up to 368 bulk power system transformers would be damaged, could be damaged or destroyed after a significant GMD event. There was a counter study then performed by EPRI and DOE that asserted that the grid would collapse before that damage occurred. That's a great point. We established, in either case, it does not matter. Wholesale collapse of the power grid for days or a week or more would cost so much money and so much suffering that the standard was justified. So FERC, on its own motion, ordered the standard to be developed. It gave guidelines to NERC. NERC developed a consensus process. FERC then approves it because it establishes a baseline. At least there's a baseline. But when it approved these standards, subsequent standards from NERC, there were iterations. So 3 separate times, when FERC approved the standard, it directed modifications to that standard. And that really goes back to the crux of the standards themselves. And what we've said openly is that for national security purposes, and this is part of the oral remarks and the written testimony, the standards development process is too slow. It takes years to develop a standard. It's too open. Our adversaries can read the standards and design around them as quickly as the standards are put into place, and it's not necessarily responsive to the Commission's directive. So the standard that we have is a result of industry consensus, and at least it's a basis. That's why FERC uses a dual-fold approach and works with, I've known Dr. Baker for years, and we work together on this issue. We use best practices collaborating with the Department of Energy, Department of Homeland Security, the Intel community, and we do classified briefings with industry members to say, you don't have to put this everywhere. But for those most critical points, and if you remember our last hearing, we modeled those critical points and said, here are the most critical points on the system where if you use best practices, it may be enough to dissuade adversarial action against.
Okay, again, somebody answer the question. You guys be willing to jump in here. We already had specs to harden our military assets. Again, I believe in the KISS principle. Keep it simple. Why wouldn't we just go to that? Those things have been available for how long, Dr. Baker? How long have we been hardening our military assets against EMP and GMD?
We started in the 1960s with a Minuteman system. Our first EMP protection standard came out in 1992, I believe.
So we've had a standard that required no further research whatsoever to start hardening critical assets. One of the parts of your testimony, and this is one of the reasons I've got a fire under my you-know-what on this, is we are now creating these microgrids that, according to your testimony, Dr. Baker, would cost 2 to 5% more to hit the military standard
and the GMD,
for protection.
Right.
But unless we have a top-down standard set by FERC and NERC or the Department of Energy, Department of Homeland Security, it won't happen, correct? I mean, I could ask industry about this. So, again, why wouldn't we do that? Is there any reason not to do that? Is there any reason why Senator Mikowski's staff here in her Energy Committee shouldn't hop on this right away and pass a law that says this will be the standard? Particularly for microgrids, because that's right now sort of the urgent problem.
Right. This is a watershed moment for microgrids. Yeah.
Go ahead, Mr. Horton.
Tape on my name, so I can't.
Just, hit your button and start talking. Guys, this is really kind of a free-for-all here, okay? I'm sorry, but I think it's the best way of doing this.
So, you're aware our final report is out, or
A
not
little bit
out
closer
yet, so I
and a
can't-
little bit louder.
I know you're aware that our final report's not out, so I can't go into a whole lot of detail, but your question is basically the initial question that we were answering as a part of our research is the mill standards, and to be specific, it would be the unclassified mill standards. Those exist. Could you go apply them to a utility? So one of the first things we did as a part of our research was, without knowing anything else, if you took the unclassed military standards and applied them to a substation, for example, in an electric grid, what would that look like? And through that process, and keep in mind that those standards, and I'm speaking to the military standards, were never designed to harden utility-type assets. So as we got into the details a little bit, a lot of it you could use, but there were some things that if you were to use them, you could actually create potential issues. So one of the, I guess the basic answer to your question is, when you take those standards and begin to apply them to utilities, the devil is in the detail. So working out some of that is a research need, which we have done as a part of this research project.
But we've been doing this for, let's just go back to, instead of 60s, to 2001, the first EMP commission. So this is 18 years. And again, the question I'd ask, what have we actually, we've taken it seriously, what have we actually done other than literally admire the problem?
So as a part of our research, we have identified, I prefer not to go in that today, but we have identified actions that utilities can do to harden against E1 EMP, for example, using non-military. April 30th of this year, 2 months from now, basically.
Okay, good. Look forward to seeing it.
The industry, Senator.
Well, I don't want to get off track here, but I want to get back to GMDs and the discussion. Mr. McClellan, you mentioned that the standards are put in place for the industry now. My understanding, though, is that the standards are assuming that it's a Carrington-type event that we've talked about is a 1,000-year event. Is that accurate? So you're not really planning for that basically that type of event would overwhelm the grid?
Yeah, I don't know the specific tie back to Carrington, but I can say that it does not consider a Carrington-type event. No, the standards would not do that.
Right. So if we had a Carrington-type event, we'd be in serious trouble because the standards don't do that. So with Dr. Casper, so I think the industry thinks, or at least based on these standards, that this is like a 1,000-year event. You mentioned in your testimony every decade it could be up to a 10% chance. We missed one just a few years ago by 9 days. Mm-hmm. What does the science tell you?
Well, I reviewed the standard, and I see the argument that it's largely based off of events like an event in 1989, which is well studied. And one of the problems with the Carrington event is we didn't have spacecraft back then, so we don't have enough data. And if you'd asked me and my community 10 years ago, we'd say maybe this is a 1 in a 1,000-year event. But since then, we've had more events. So, in 2012, one of our spacecraft called Stereo intercepted a larger than Carrington, actually, we think, event heading away from the sun. And it actually took a year or two to realize just how substantial that event was and really process it. But we're clearly seeing they're happening on a repeating basis. So we know that they're happening, and we have their spacecraft observations that tell us how strong the magnetic field is. It would be wonderful to be able to model what that event would have done to Earth and use that as a basis for probably a more common large-scale event.
Is there any scale we can compare, like if that was a 10, what is the FERC spec?
Yeah.
Are we hardened to a 3? Are we hardened to a 9? I mean, how far beyond are we? I guess, Dr. Baker, you want to?
There was a FERC Oak Ridge National Lab study that was based on a 1921, it's called a railroad storm, which in Earth's magnetic field disturbance terms was a 5,000 nanotesla per minute storm. The 1989 event, which is pretty close to what we're having the GMD standard, was a 500 nanotesla per minute, 1/10 of a 1921 storm, which was 100 years ago.
So the standard is set standard's set really low. I mean, anybody want to dispute that? The GMP standard right now, by FERC to NERC to industry, is really low. You know, maybe on the order.
It's not defense
versus
conservative.
a 10, or I mean, it'd be nice to try and, for laymen, to try and get it down to those types of terms so we can kind of describe this to people. But that's what we're trying to look for.
Does anybody dispute that they're very low?
I would add maybe a technical detail. So the March 1989 event, so we talk nanoteslas. Another way to look at this is electric field levels. So it's on the order of 2 volts per kilometer. And the benchmark TPL7 1 in 100 year event for the same geomagnetic latitude is 8 volts per kilometer. So it's actually about 4 times higher than what the 1989 event. Now, that compared to the 1921 event, I don't know the details of that, but it's...
The 21 event, if you believe Faraday's law, would be 20 volts per kilometer.
The length of transmission line, it just keeps growing too, right? So I mean, it's not necessarily the intensity of just the burst, it's how long the transmission line you've got that it just accumulates, correct? Or am I misinterpreting that? Okay?
Right.
Oh, Senator Rosen. By the way, just hop in.
Okay.
Start talking.
Well, I know I'm new to the committee, so I have a couple of questions about the resiliency and the redundancy of our grid. Of course, we have multiple grids, our military grid, our commercial grid, what I like to call our distributed grid that will have solar, wind farms, geothermal, water power, and of course, cyber communications now, wireless communications, all part of the interconnectivity of this grid. So can you tell me how these bursts are impacting the wireless communication between these distributed grids, and and then second part is what's the resiliency and redundancy that is built in, so if one piece, we know everything's connected, so if one cyber attack, maybe they can just hit us from a satellite down to a grid and it goes out. What's the resiliency and redundancy you have built in for that, please?
So I'll start. But I'm going to rely heavily on a couple of the engineers who are sitting to my left. You raise a really important point about interconnectivity, not just of the grid itself, but to other critical sectors.
Not so much transmission lines as wireless
is the actual
between our
communication.
Satellites as they circle around the Earth now.
That's exactly right. So for us to be able to operate, I think one of the things that I want to kind of challenge is that the electric sector wouldn't do anything but for standards. I think that may be true 15, 20 years ago. That might be older history, but I think given the shift in geopolitical threats to our nation and our sector being particularly key to our national security, this is why the sector came together at the CEO level to start really focusing on some of the threats that we're facing. We're proud of the progress that we've made. Again, I would kind of push back on we wouldn't do anything. There are good examples of things that we are doing to protect our systems, but what you have to recognize is we could harden everything to mil spec.
That's right.
It would probably cost an awful lot of money to provide electricity to our customers, but if we don't have water, we can't generate steam or cool systems. If we don't have telecommunications, we can't operate. If we don't have transportation and pipelines, we can't move fuel. So looking at this, to use Dr. Baker's language of a top-down, holistic sort of defense minimum, we do have to be thinking about this in terms of a lot of cross-sector impact. That said, we also have to be doing this from a risk-based approach. One of the things that's most important, and again, I think the military did it similarly, which is you prioritize. We weren't putting mil-spec EMP hardening on the PX, but we were on command and control assets. So what are those key assets in the North American electric grid that we ought to be hardening to a particular level?
And what's connected to it outside? You can harden this building, but there's so many connections into this, not necessarily hard transmission lines.
So the one thing I would respond to on that is one of the defenses that we have as a sector is the biodiversity. So if you've seen one control center, you've seen one control center. If you've seen one sort of company's structure and their, we'll call them their substation settings, you've seen one. From a cyber perspective in particular, that gives us an awful lot of resilience, because an adversary can attack one company, and they've attacked one company. Because of the resilience, the redundancy, the biodiversity in the grid, we do have excess capacity, spinning reserves, the ability to move electricity in different ways. Now, one of the things that I'm passionate about is, from an engineering perspective, I've talked to engineers before who have said, we would just re-engineer the system if blank happened. Do we know what that looks like? have we done that before? Can we test it? Can we prove it?
Right.
So this goes, sound science needs sound policy, or sound science results in sound policy. These studies, while we call it admiring the problem, it's not admiring the problem, it's making sure we're doing the right things so that we can have more resilience and do it in a cost-effective way.
And so now with quantum computing, with all kinds of things, what do you feel that you can do with predictive modeling so you can simulate these things and you can actually run some disaster recovery plans all on a computer, right?
There is terrific
tell me what
modeling,
you're
and I'm
doing
going to
with
look
that,
over
please.
at Karen Evans
And
for
what
that.
can we do to help you improve that modeling, thus improving not only the predictability, but also the bringing us back up in case of an event?
Okay. So, there was a lot in your question.
Sorry.
No,
It's exciting
which is,
topic.
No,
It's
which
exciting
is awesome
topic.
because there's a lot to get to your point about the discussion and what our agency's doing and how we are approaching this this situation from a whole of government approach. But to the modeling and what we do at the national labs, and so what we're doing within Department of Energy, which was required through the FAST Act of 2015, that other components within DOE are looking at. So we are currently building a model right now. We call it the North American Resiliency Model, otherwise known as the NARM, which Assistant Secretary Walker has talked about, and that's what he's building. So it's to model exactly what you're talking about. But the requirements under the FAST Act that Senator Markowski and that committee's leadership has said was you have to identify what are the critical assets across in the energy sector, and then what are the interdependencies. So in the defense critical energy infrastructure base as well, it's what are those energy resources that are critical to the Department of Energy, then they can do certain things within the DoD parameter. Then what is outside that parameter, which is in the energy sector, how do we rely on private sector with that? Collect the data. The critical points that Mr. McClellan is talking about is in this model. So we anticipate as DOE that this first modeling will be done by the fall. Then to your point, there is capabilities in the national labs under quantum computing, under the data. What we're doing in the CSER program is, and the work that we're doing with tri-sector with DHS is you put the data on top of that so that you can actually start doing the modeling and what is the impact of that and integrate that in under these scenarios and test scenarios so that to your point about should we put this standard in place, there's a cost associated with all of these, right? And most of this infrastructure is owned by private industry. So as we go forward, what we're going to have to do is provide enough information with good science that informs the investment of does it make sense on this list from a top-down approach, how much does the federal government do in order to protect what is the risk associated with these types of events? And then what does industry match us as what is that risk and what is going to happen so that we can do the modeling?
So, I remember a hearing a couple of years ago where we had GAO, and they had, issued a report on the results of the EMP Commission, and they had, I think, A through O about quick fixes, things we have to do. And the testimony after years of those recommendations being out there, we had done none of them. And these were tasked to Department of Energy and to DHS, and they had done nothing. So again, I keep coming back to the point, prioritization. Listen, I'd like to operate with perfect information. I'd like to, if you make a $1 investment, that's a solid dollar investment. It's not wasted all. And I don't blame industry. You're not going to act until government forces you to act. I blame government for being very slow off the mark. We finally, after a couple of years, got SIPA passed, which was basically, the argument was, is it a strategy or a plan? Well, we called for a report from DHS. We got it a year late. It's 23 pages of basically a strategy, develop a plan. I mean, there are no action items. So I go back to EMP Commission, some quick fixes. We've talked about, okay, we don't have perfect science, but we do know if we start blowing large power transformers, we can't replace them. And the redundancy in terms of, sharing with other utilities, well, if you're all wiped out, that doesn't work very well. Okay, if we're completely down, how do you dark start the entire grid? So again, I'm looking for prioritization of action to actually do something to start mitigating this as opposed to, We're going to wait for the model.
I gotta do it.
We'll tell that we'll, inform our study, which will start maybe developing a plan. Then there'll be a new administration. Then we'll have another law passed, and we'll have to do a study on that. I mean, are you sensing some frustration from at least the chair? Okay,
Yes, sir.
Ms. Evans, sure.
Okay, so yes, sir, I sense your frustration, and the model is not the only activity that's being done jointly within the community. And so when you look at the list and you look at the action items again, I believe Secretary Perry and what this administration has done is take the frustration of what you're saying and what is the responsibilities and what is expected of Congress back to the Department of Energy. That is exactly why my office was formed. It's not just cybersecurity, but it's energy security and then the response. So to some of the stuff that you're talking about as it relates to response, we hold joint exercises. The exercises are critical, the exercises are tangible, they're scheduled, and they're scenario-based. And the point of that is to test out, you have a plan in place. The time that the incident occurs is not the time for us to be testing the plan. So the exercises are set up for us to actually test, do we have the right things in place, and where are the gaps in our research so that we can then redirect the research. So I did bring specific activities of the research that we're doing in the department, how much we've applied to that, and how we are moving forward with our national labs to be able to do the modeling, to do the predictive pieces.
And you're confusing activity with action to actually mitigate, okay?
No. But if you have an exercise and you see where you don't have the strategy. For example, we did it jointly with DOD, the Liberty Eclipse exercise up in Plum Island. That's a dark start. Okay, if you don't have the equipment pre-positioned, which is things that we have learned from the hurricane responses of doing mutual assistance, then you can start looking at how do you redo some of those things? How do you rechannel? What are the interdependencies, and then how do we have to then either come to Congress and say we have gaps in our authorities, or we have to go out to industry and our industry partners and say we have to adjust the mutual assistance agreements that we have out there, or this is how some of these things, or eventually, to your point, we have enough information that we then go to FERC and NERC and say, now we need to establish a standard.
How can we help you here in Congress to bridge these gaps? I've worked on disaster recovery plans and computer systems. That's how you learn. That's how you find out the holes. You go back and you keep practicing. Of course, it's like practicing for the big game, right? And so, you have private industry. They're not going to do anything, maybe unless we make them, maybe not. They do have assets to protect. But what do you need from us, I think, specifically, to try to help form this maybe triad or multiple partnerships so we're working on a goal with action items that is tangible? Not saying we did our test, we show the whole, will you, can you, maybe. What can we do here legislatively to support you in the mission that you have reaching out to your different communities?
Can we start, Mr. Roop? And we'll kind of work our way down here.
Good, everybody, yeah.
I wanted to get back to your point, is the industry doing anything? As I indicated in my written testimony, we have replaced all of our capacitor banks and all of our major power transformers with ones that are hardened to handle the GMD and the E3 event. We've also gone beyond the NERC planning standards to understand severe stress levels on our system and put monitoring equipment on so we know what actions to take to separate the system and take stuff out of service before it should fail. Those are actions we've done because we know we've got to protect our grid. That's part of our business. The issue we've got is we use mil specs where it makes sense. We just built a new operating center, and it is a full mil spec operating center. Everything's protected in it. But the problem with that is I can't do it in the substations because the consequences it has on the protection equipment I've got that protects our system every day. I don't want to do something that's caused daily harm to our system. So the next study, and hopefully in the next 12 months with the EPRI work with the federal partners, we can figure out how to protect reasonably that kind of equipment so that we can now implement that solution. But we also need EMP communications, and we're trying to get that stood up and do that by October this year through the Electric Sector Coordinating Council. So this industry is working very hard at it, but we just can't assume something and throw it out there because I don't want to collapse the grid in the process. So that's,
listen, again,
that's the issue we've got.
I understand.
And that's what we're trying to get through right now.
No, I understand that, and I realize Dominion is forward-leaning on this, but to what GMD spec did you harden your...
Well, we've gone beyond the spec, and we've stressed our system, but I'll be honest with you, we're trying to push the bounds, and we're working with NASA, U.S. Geological Survey, NOAA, and EPRI. We're trying to understand what are the limits of the network, and we're not the only ones. We're working with other utilities across the United States to understand, and they're also doing the same exercise we're doing, because we're trying to understand where is the issue, but we've also got a sparing plan where if everything goes out, I can get my system back up with the spares I've got. And we've done that proactively because they're out of service. They're not going to be impacted by a solar storm. They're not going to be impacted by electromagnetic.
So you already have the large power transformers?
Yeah, yes, sir. We've already done it. And we've done it based on the work with DOE on a minimum grid model. We did that as part of the FAST Act work with them. And that's really helped us kind of understand where your stress levels are. And so this work they're doing now is extremely important to give to the rest of the industry.
But
so
if I could just follow up there, we did that you have higher standards. You've gone further. You've made additional investments into your grid. I think it's partly because of a lot of the sensitive assets here in the D.C. area that will need that kind of protection from disturbance. You're assuming, though, I think all of you are assuming that you're taking on the storm, the GMD event. Your systems are taking on the storm. You haven't changed anything. What would it be if we have better forecasting, that we actually know this storm is coming? Would anything change in terms of your preparedness? And right now, that detection, my understanding is we can detect GMD events like we could hurricanes in the 1930s, so that's not all that great. But if we made those kinds of investments, how would you react?
That would be excellent. I'll be honest with you, that's why we're working so close with NASA. We think right now the way we do the studies, we assume the field's moving all the time and at different orientations against our transmission lines. In reality, that's probably not what's going to happen, but we don't know how it's going to affect us. So you make the worst guess if you can. And so forewarning and a better computer models that we're getting and with what NASA and others are working on would very much help us.
How much time would you need?
If we had 24 to 48 hour notice, it would be wonderful.
What would you do? We had testimony with that kind of notice, and we could shut down the grid. And the question I asked, okay, who's going to make that call? And
right.
there was, of course, no answer.
Yeah.
Who's, so
Secretary of Energy.
Who would make that call?
Well, I say there is an answer now because of the FAST Act. The Grid Security Emergency Authority now resides at the Department of Energy.
So who would make the call?
Who would make the call?
So the Secretary would make a recommendation to the President saying that we are in a grid emergency, and then the President would then make the call. It would be based on information that we are jointly working with the industry. But the FAST Act put that in place, and one of the things that I'm working on right now is what is that level of gradation that goes up that constitutes this is a grid emergency, so therefore the Secretary needs to make that recommendation.
How much time do you need?
How much time do we need
to go through that
declare?
process?
We are past. I'm accelerating everything we're doing. We're testing several data collection things now that we should be with the national labs, have an operational capability to see we can do it by April, of having the data that then can then get into the hands of everybody looking at it to be able to then say, okay, at this circumstance, it constitutes this. And we would work jointly with our whole of government approach and with the National Security Council to make that determination.
But if NOAA gave you a warning that a major space weather event is heading here now, how much time do you need to go through that process? Because I think, Dr. Casper, you said sometimes it's 10 minutes warning. That's not going to happen, right?
Yeah, right now with our spacecraft at L1 with NOAA's Discover spacecraft, for a severe storm, it's 19 minutes. For typical storms, it's more like an hour.
So 19 minutes to an hour. Would you act that fast?
Yes, sir. The intent is to have the information available for the Secretary to respond that fast for the nation. That is what we're building.
But would the order be to shut the entire grid down?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
No, not necessarily. So one of the things that the Sector Coordinating Council has been doing in partnership with the Department of Energy is to develop template orders so that we're not figuring out what orders look like the day that they happen, but actually have some things and have an understanding of if this, then this. And so that's going to be extremely important. I would say from, shutting down the grid so that the spinning equipment is not impacted is an option. But one of the things that the existing operating procedure standard requires would be, or not requires, but enables, is reliability coordinators who have responsibility for reliability within a region would be able to spin up additional reserves or have additional capacity in that particular area in case of some sort of loss of load. Again, I would rely on the engineers over here, but there are a lot of different ways to protect against GMP.
The point of shutting down would be to protect the equipment. You're not talking about throwing more things on load. Dr. Baker, you've been pretty patient. Then Mr. McClendon.
Yeah.
Dr. Baker.
Right, yeah. So in answer to the question about what do we need to do, one of the most important things is to get EMP up on the same footing as GMD. We have a GMD standard. There's nothing. There's no guidance at all on EMP, and as a result, the industry is not doing very much of anything. On the question of modeling, we've done modeling of the grid. FERC has done it, but Wellinghoff it pointed to if you could take out the right 9 substations, you could shut down the U.S. for 18 months, 9 substations. So we have a pretty good idea.
Which ones?
Huh? What?
Don't mention which ones.
Okay, but there have been models, and there are things that we know that we could take charge, move out now, to protect the substations that are the key to keeping the bulk power grid running anyway.
We know that, but we haven't done anything about it.
No.
Or very little about it.
Right.
I mean, do you dispute the fact that we don't have any EMP standards and really not do anything about EMP?
The industry's done quite a bit ever since the FERC comments over the number of substations that could be impacted across the grid. That's one of the reasons why we work with Oak Ridge Labs and the industry to develop the probability risk assessment to really understand where your stress points were. And that's been shared with the industry. It's really helped us pinpoint which substations need to be hardened, both physically, from cyber for EMP, and we've almost completed hardening all of ours. The industry's doing the same. It's been shared through NERC now in a guide. So there's a lot that's been done, and we've refined the early FERC work. So I think we've got better actions as to where to go. But so we've done a lot. It's just that's the type of risk you don't share because it's telling the adversary what the targets are.
I understand.
Could I ask a quick technical question? In the scenario in which you had some notice of a significant GMD event and you were able to shut down some portion or all of the grid, how much protection does that provide? I mean, when it passes, do you turn the switch back on and everything's fine? Or has a great deal of damage been done but not as much as what would have been done? Doctor?
I'm told that we had a big DOE session to define their EMP action plan, and we had a very large utility, electric power grid contingent there, and they told me, I was leading the discussion, that they wanted to resist shutting the grid down at all costs, that shutting the grid down would cause more problems because of the startup transients. When you try to restart the grid, you get these electric voltage overshoots that will damage equipment, and so that's not a panacea.
It's not a solution. Yeah. Right. Mr. McClendon.
So there's so much to comment on. So to begin with, if we look at operator action, manual action, there is a standard by NERC now, EOP 10, that does require space weather forecasting and mitigation plans in the event of a space weather event. So to answer the question from earlier on, a good forecast would help an operator better prepare to take action. However, the Commission found that operator action alone is not sufficient. There will be times whenever operators make errors, there should be automatic equipment available that would override and take action to stop the GMD event. To the other point, concerning the rigor of the NERC standards, any level, any threshold that one picks for GMD is certainly going to be exceeded. So the question would be how far in excess, or a better question would be what to do to automatically protect the equipment. The assessments that NERC lists are the beginning of a process. That process, the expectation I would have for the process is that any transformer manufacturer or any transformer owner is going to look at the exceed level. What is the level at which that transformer is going to be overwhelmed and take damage or be destroyed. At that point, that transformer should be tripped off automatically. That's not an expensive solution. That's a very targeted solution that can be put into place. The technology exists, so a relay with a pickup coil on the neutral bushing of the transformer, and then you can debate and study what level of space weather event you might have. Also, to the question about notice, although better forecasting would certainly help with the GMD event if the operator were prepared to take action and everything goes right, it's not going to necessarily help with an EMP event. And one of the nice things about mitigating GMD, if the GMD is done right, it'll also mitigate E3 on the EMP event regardless of what level one selects. And Randy and I can talk about that level later on, but for a GMD event, FERC did find, and it's a matter of perspective also. You asked earlier on why the subject matter experts disagree. It really is a matter of assumptions, and it's a matter of a basis for setting the threat. What is the threat, and how much rigor do you place on the threat? What level of space weather, for instance, do you pick to mitigate against? But if you're doing it on a protection basis, because even if you harden a transformer, at what point will the transformer be exceeded?
So let me just say, and we'll turn to Mr. Casper. If I were king, I would say shutting down the grid is not an option. Ain't going to happen. Can't react in time. It's just going to be too damaging in and of itself. So that goes to your automatic mitigation. That's what we're trying to do. What technology can we bring to bear? Richard Garland said, $100,000 capacitor, we've protected all this. I don't think that's necessarily true. You're talking, some kind of breaker system. For GMD, might be able to do it. EMP is just too rapid acting. So what we're trying to accomplish in this roundtable is set up I don't even want to say a process. I want to come up with things we can actually do. We'll spend the money. We've heard, in your testimony, you said about $50 billion. In comparison to the catastrophe, that's money pretty well spent, and can certainly be recovered through fees and everything else. Okay, so we have to come up with some action items, even if we don't get it right. I don't care if it's not 100% perfect. It's a lot better than the position we're in, and is well worth the money spent to mitigate the risk. Mr. Casper.
Yeah, one of the items I touched on earlier was the regional forecasts. And I think one of the issues right now is not only do we only provide an hour to 20 minutes warning, but we've got like a thumb up in the solar wind. It's okay, it's getting intense now, but you can clearly see there's more than one parameter that affects the severity of the storm. But I also think if we could deliver a regional forecast, I think it would be a lot easier to contemplate shutting off New England for a few hours than shutting off all of North America. So not only do I think we need spacecraft that are closer to the sun to give more time, but we need to be able to provide people with better data than just one number for how all of Earth is going to respond to each event.
Mr. Roop, again, please speak to shutting down the grid.
Yeah, that's something we don't do lightly. I'll be very honest with you.
Right. And why?
But we've got a lot of resiliency built into the grid, and what we've done with the power transformers is typically they have a lot of thermal margin, we call it. That's what they get stressed at. So what we've done now is every one we buy has 125% overload, extra thermal margin to it, and they've also got components to reduce the stress level per heating. And if you overload a transformer or you overheat it, we may lose life, but that doesn't mean it's going to fail right away. So you take risk every day. If we've got a major event going on in the United States today and we have to overload a transformer for a period of time, we'll do that and take risk on the loss of life of that unit. And that's what we would do in those kind of events.
But again, it all depends on the magnitude of the overload. And the problem with EMP or really significant GMD event, the overload may be so dramatic that there's just no safety factor in the transformer.
If you get to that level, you're going to have voltage collapse, and our protective systems will drop the system out automatically at that point. So we've got, I'll call them safety valves, for a better word, in the system built in to be able to react to that. We also have system operators that if they see a severe contingency, they have the rights and the authority to drop that area.
But again, EMP occurs in fractions of a second, right?
That's right.
Mr. Baker, or Dr. Baker.
The same group of industry representatives at the DOE plan development, I was surprised. They said, we would like to protect the grid so we don't have to shut it off. And there are protective devices where that they're still under test, but it may be possible that you can at least protect portions of the grid so it would operate through a GMD, a severe GMD, or an EMP.
And again, that's really the purpose of this roundtable, is to identify those priority items that we can actually do. If there is equipment now, and we can upgrade as technology improves, but start doing something now.
Mr. Vespel, you mentioned something in your system. What was it? A
neutral
device?
insertion device?
Yeah. Would you elaborate on that, and would that be a potential action?
That's strictly for GMD, though, correct?
Well, it has some effect, too, on the E3 for EMP.
Yeah. Would you elaborate on all that and let us know?
So it's an automatic device. It senses when that DC type of current is flowing, and it'll interrupt it to protect the transformer. It's a prototype, what we have, and we put it in a substation with just one transformer, knowing that if it interrupts that current, we wanted to know what would happen to the rest of the system. It's a little bit like whack-a-mole. If you stop the current flowing in that transformer, it's got to go somewhere. It looks for another path.
Right.
So we're trying to monitor to see, how is this going to react with the rest of the system, and does it affect other transformers.
Again, I'm certainly mindful of the complexity of this, and that you put something in here and you have to be really careful about how it affects the rest of the grid. I mean, I do understand that. Again, if you want to talk, put your thing up like Dr. Baker.
Thank you both. So, similar to Mr. McClellan, I have a lot that I want to react to. But I think what you just heard from both Mr. Vespelic and Dr. Baker about the complexity, about the testing and potential unintended consequences is a really big deal. So this notion that nothing is happening except we're admiring the problem, actually we are admiring the problem in the wild right now by actually deploying different potential solutions and mitigation strategies. Some of the mitigation strategies, as you're noting, are to prevent impact from happening. Another way that we look at resilience is you cannot protect everything from everything all of the time. If you're talking about an intelligent adversary, we've got to be right 100% of the time. The adversary has to be right once. We also have to be focusing on response recovery, preparing for a potential impact. And so in addition to what we're talking about with blocking devices and some of those things, Mr. Roop referred to some of the spare equipment programs that we've got. Something else that we are developing at the direction of the Sector Coordinating Council known as Supplemental Operating Strategies, or SOS. This notion that can we operate the grid in a degraded state? So there is impact, and I'll push back on that 9 substation remark real quickly too. That was based on static modeling. And the idea is if those 9 substations evaporated and we had no other contingencies, there would be impact to the system. Even if they evaporated, we have other ways to pick up that load. We have other ways to engineer around those problems. You see it all the time. You saw what happened in Mexico Beach, for example, down in the panhandle of Florida after Hurricane Irma this past year, or Michael rather this past year. There was impact there. We were able to rebuild the system in a short order, and the rest of the surrounding area was able to get back up and running fairly quickly. So this is one of the ways that we're taking physical, natural hazards and applying our resilience and recovery methods to potential cyber, physical, or EMP type events. So looking at it as all hazards, looking at it not just before the incident, but what we do to respond and recover, having supplemental operating strategy, being able to operate manually, being able to move equipment around, these things, and I think you noted it, Chairman Johnson, these pieces of equipment are enormous. They are critical to the effective operation of the grid. We have a lot of spare equipment that is not operational today that can not just be put into service in a place where it might need to be, but also we've been working with, again, cross-sector, the transportation sector, to be able to move these things as expeditiously as possible. Last thing I want to say, and I'm sorry that Senator Rosen isn't here anymore, but that very direct question of what can Congress do to help? I think we're all kind of falling on some things that would help. Money is always, if you're talking about national security and you're talking about mil-spec, rather than customers bearing the cost of something that is a national security issue, there are ways that I think that we can find federal money to do some of these things. I think in the spirit of money, also working with us in our commissions at the state and federal level so that these costs can be recovered. So support for cost recovery, having your leadership this really matters, State Commission. This is why this company is coming for cost recovery, I think is going to carry a lot of weight. Earlier warning was already discussed.
Let me just chime in. As a fiscal conservative, I will carry the water as long as I know what it is we're supposed to do.
Amen.
And that's what's been so frustrating to me. It's just like, well, what can we do? Let's actually act. Let's actually spend some money on things that actually mitigate this.
And this is why EPRI's work is so important. I think if we would have done some of the this is the right thing to do. It's mil-spec. It's easy. We've done it for 20 years. Why aren't we doing it on the electric sector? We might have had unintended consequences. We might not have had sound mitigation. We probably would have lost 3 or 4 years. By doing sound science now, getting specific mitigation, and then, and I don't know if Randy's able to say this or not, but following this report, companies are not just going to take the report and say, oh, now we know what mitigation looks like. Companies are going to pilot some of these mitigation strategies so that we can do it out in the wild. Once we have a better sense of what mitigation looks like, there might be ways, it might be very specific asks for funding. And then the last thing I'd say, access to classified information. I don't think this has been as big a problem this go-round with EPRI and their work with DOD, but being able to see what does an EMP from a high-altitude nuclear weapon really look like on our system at a very highly classified level so that we can make informed decisions based on the things that Dr. Baker probably knows.
Okay. I think it's Mr. Harrell, Dr. Baker, then Ms. Evans.
Thank you very much. Just as a former regulator and kind of somebody who has been regulated and now kind of seeing this through a government lens, I do want to suggest that a lot of investments within industry, within particularly this industry, have been made. And I will point back to some of the action items that have come up over the last number of years, really since 2006, 2007's time frame. And I'll point to the grid security exercise that NERC did many years ago. The first one was back in 2011. Every other year there has been an exercise since, and they have really taken a hard look at some of the catastrophic grid reliability issues, and this certainly would be in that same vein. So I do want to suggest that there's a lot of work and a lot of thought that has gone beyond or behind a reliability issue. As DHS pushed out their 2018 strategy and soon to be an implementation plan, I do want to suggest that we have started to get a lot more granular as to the risks associated with not necessarily EMP, but all risks. And so, right now we are in the process of moving towards mapping the national critical functions and what does that mean kind of underneath it, where we get a little bit granular, the things that we need in which to operate critical infrastructure in this country. What is it, so that we can kind of pinpoint what actually needs to be mitigated based off of risk.
That's fine. I mean, I want to solve all the problems, but, I'd like to solve this one now. I mean, let's kind of take a step-by-step approach. I believe it's Dr. Baker, then Ms. Evans.
A couple of things. One is that the NERC exercises did not include EMP, at least to my knowledge. The other point is I would venture, this is something we need to check, but I suspect if you protect transformers to the EMP E3, as specified in the MIL Standard 188-125, they will also survive any GMD. Now, we haven't done any testing of the large transformers, but the first one, Duke Energy has made one available. We're going to test it down in South Carolina. But I think we need to look into the possibility that if you protect the heavy duty, the transformers and substations, generator step-up transformers to the EMP E3, they will also survive to the GMD.
But again, they're still vulnerable to the E1 and E2, correct?
Right, but I'm just looking at the GMD. So if you protect to the EMP standard, mil spec, you will also have protected to GMD.
Okay. I mean, I think I've always assumed that. I thought GMD pretty well was
very close.
Correct. Yeah.
I mean, we need to do some testing, obviously.
Good enough for government work.
But again, and I'm pushing back on what Randy said. The MIL Standard 188-125 tells you how to test transformers, 1,000 amps per phase.
Okay.
That's unclassified. Okay.
I'm going to lose Senator Peters here pretty quick, but don't worry, I'll stick around. Senator Peters, do you have any other questions before you have to leave? Okay, Ms. Evans.
Thank you. The one thing that I really want to stress, and I think Dr. Baker has put this in his action items, is it's not to reinvent the wheel, but to leverage a lot of the work that's already been done by DOD. Our national labs, because a lot of the stuff that people are talking about is, we're actually testing on the live system. We have directed our national labs to be able to actually simulate and do assessments under these scenarios. To your point about you need to have the data in order to be what can we do today? What is the long-range plan and what is that roadmap? That is specifically why we're putting this roadmap together so that we can have this data. But the labs are working on this now. And whether you agree or not, and I think it's been said by DHS and also by Caitlin earlier, is that the risk of some of this is low in how it's going to happen, but when it does happen, the effects are catastrophic, right? So we all agree on that. So the way that we're doing the work is prioritizing it based on the risk across the board, but taking into effect, especially what Mr. Aronson has said is, okay, we do this in other areas, so this is another threat that we have to build into the current scenarios that we have. So to your point, there is testing, there is the assessments, then that we are leveraging the national lab capabilities because they do the same, they do the work for DoD as well. So we're not reinventing that. We're trying to make sure that we have the data that we can share out so that it informs everyone's decision as we go forward.
No, listen, to the extent as we're designing solutions, if you can have a solution for multiple problems. Again, if you're shut down and you've got to recover, probably similar process, whether it's cyber, whether it's EMP, whether it's
Absolutely.
GMP. So again,
so you have to be able to test that scenario in a testing lab environment because you really don't want to affect your customers while you're putting on, okay, this is a prototype equipment. What's the effect of that going to be? What are the scenarios? What are the assumptions if we implement this type of standard? So the labs, we have directed the labs. They've been working on this since on 18 and 19. We're continuing this work so that we can say, and here's the data. Here's the impact. Do you want to accelerate that? Because that's a risk that we're not willing to take as a nation. That's the kind of information I think Congress needs to have to be able to get to the point that you want to take an action.
And again, I think that's the purpose of this roundtable is to, I realize this is hopefully a very low probability. Certainly EMP is very low probability. I think it's a growing probability, unfortunately. GMD is not if, but when, okay? So we're trying to raise this profile. We have sat back and we just haven't done very many things. It hasn't raised the type of, let's face it, the awareness like climate change. Let's throw hundreds of billions of dollars at climate change, just in case. Well, I think we ought to do something just in case here. A little off point, but I am, because Chairman of Homeland Security, we're also, and Foreign Relations, I'm aware of what Russia did from a cyber standpoint in Ukraine. And it's my understanding, again, being non-technical, the only reason Ukraine was able to reestablish and start up their grid is because they had the old-fashioned breakers. And I know there's a bill pending. I think it's Senator King and Senator Risch. And by the way, I was at Idaho Lab. Great facility, wonderful people, talking way over my head, but I appreciate that. To study, I think $10 million to study where should we maybe put some lower technology breakers, and I'm kind of hoping all of you kind of take a look at that as well. And Mr. Roop, are you kind of smiling on that one, or? Again, we'll get back into EMP, GMD as long as I've raised that issue. Well, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, what we've tried to do in the design of our system is have manual override so we can bring the system back up. That's extremely important, and you use human RTU if you have to try to bring your system back. And so we've got manual overrides built into our system. The problem is some of the protective relaying with the dynamics we've got on the system now, we have to use power electronic relays or else the system gets unstable. And that's the reason why this next point, the next phase with the EPRI work is so important, is how I protect those relays cost effectively is, to me, is where we've got to get soon as an industry so we can fast deploy that. And there's some very specific research areas that we've been led to with the EPRI work. The stuff that's low-hanging fruit, I will call it, it won't hurt the system. We go ahead and do. We've already done that in our standards. The industry's doing it. Other utilities across the industries already looking at the preliminary reports with EPRI, and we've been doing that across the networks. But there's some specific areas that we really need to address quickly if we want to get ahead of this problem. And that's where the labs can help us, because if some of the technology we try don't work, we're going to need to figure out what will work. And so that partnership's extremely important for us. And that's where the government really can help us in the next phase here.
But again, don't you agree that until the government actually establishes a standard, you're going to be incredibly reluctant to invest a whole lot of money in something because you just might get the standard next year and have to redo the whole thing. So I mean, isn't that a real deterrent? I mean, again, I appreciate what Dominion's already done, what Edison has done, but I think you'd probably have done a lot more if we would have given you some kind of basic standards to adhere to.
That always makes it easier, but I'm not sure standards is the excellent answer at this case at this point yet.
Right. Okay.
We really need to know what to do, and that's where I'm at right today, I think.
I'm going to respond to the people putting the things up like this.
All right.
Okay? Dr. Baker, I got rules.
Yeah, good points from Roop there. Another thing is going along with his observation. One of the things that we really need are some national test beds that are dedicated to testing integrated systems. You know, the relays, the generation stations, the substations in a connected mode. We found with EMP that assessments and models that are just based upon analysis are wrong. They're wrong. They're inaccurate. You may as well flip a coin as to whether the system's hard or not. The only way that you get any kind of confidence that you've got a system that's hard is to test it. And so
creating a test bed is not that expensive, is it?
Yeah,
I mean, I know you've got one in Idaho, but
there's Idaho is developing one. There's one at TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, and there's some in situ tests that are being set up. But that's an area where I think funding could be very helpful.
Mr. McClendon, then Mr. Aronson.
So there are really two aspects to this. One is the natural threat. And on the natural threat side, I think you've correctly said that you got to narrow the mitigation actions. So right now it's based on operator action, and I would say that automatic protection measures should also be considered and strengthened, and that's in the implementation plan. So if I get a level that overwhelms the transformer, I can still take that transformer off automatically. It's isolated to the transformer. The whole grid doesn't come down. But when it's...
But again, do you have enough time even with GMD?
I'm sorry, do
you have enough time to do that even with GMD? Let's say it is kind of localized, and we've had this in the past, Quebec, and So
No. It would have to be, in my opinion, you should not, as an engineer that's been in the industry, one should never rely, if it's a critical function, never rely on operator action alone. There are always automatic controls, automatic relays, automatic operation of the equipment.
But again, do the automatic relays work in GMD?
Yes. You can install automatic relays in GMD, and I'll talk with Dave after this. But to sense DC input on a transformer is not, in my opinion, it's not difficult to sense that operator relay and take that particular transformer off. Because if you looked at some of the latest modeling, the GMD vectors can be very specific to very different transformers under different GMD scenarios.
So was that part of your standard then that FERC gave to NERC, gave to industry?
Absolutely not. It was not part of the standard, but it was a baseline. As I said, those are baseline practices that start the discussion and start the industry moving. So now everyone has a requirement. They have to evaluate their system. They have to do an assessment. They have to do a correction action plan, and they've got to mitigate to certain levels. Now, if it's 8 volts per kilometer or if it's 75 or 85 amps per phase, one could argue that that's certainly going to be exceeded or not adequate for a significant GMD event. But again, to the point, you will always have GMD events that exceed that threshold. And so in that case, I would submit one would never count on a single standard to protect that transformer. One should put protection on that transformer. And that's something industry knows how to do, and they've done it forever. So that's something that can be done, and I feel can be done targeted, and it can be done, I think, quickly and not very expensive. And the Commission can provide cost recovery. But I'm sorry, I didn't want to miss the EMP issue either. Because EMP, the bad news is you have an intelligent adversary that studies our systems and vulnerabilities and is building weapon systems around those vulnerabilities. The good news is you have an intelligent adversary that studies our systems and vulnerabilities and is building weapon systems around that. Because to DOE's work, they're working on defense critical electric infrastructure. If those facilities survive in the event of an EMP attack, and that's a very narrow subset, if they survive, my personal opinion is that's a strong dissuasion for an adversary to perpetrate an attack.
For a couple nuclear powers, but there may be a couple that I'm not sure
That's
that
correct.
there's anything to dissuade them.
No doubt. And then that's where it's a broader subset to say what are the societal, the major societal impacts for losing very specific, very critical facilities. And that comes into that narrowing, the modeling, the engagement with industry to identify those facilities and put protection in place. Right now, DOD, DITRA is doing a tremendous job in hardening the DOD assets. They're moving with all haste and they're spending a lot of money. The same thing can be done with proper engagement with the industry, not to set a standard, but to engage with them about what are these critical, brief them to their point about classified information. What are those critical threats? Is it real? What can we do to protect against it? And what is our really all levels of protection mitigation? And just to go to an earlier point, there are still entities that have analog old electromechanical relays out there. And if you've read the SARA study, they do very, very well against EMP attack. It may not be possible to put them everywhere, but in cases where operations could be dead-banded with electromechanical relays, that's an excellent solution set. That's one that should be considered, and that's one that some of the international partners that we're working with, that's one that they're employing. So there are mitigations, targeted mitigations for specific systems that can be put into place. These can be done quickly. In my opinion, they can be done quickly with industry engagement, proper incentives, and I really don't see a reason.
Reimbursement.
We couldn't go there.
Mr. Aronson, can you first of all respond to what you talked about, surge protection on transformers on GMD, but just in general respond and then make the point you wanted to make?
So no, I can't respond on that. These guys over here can. But I'm actually really glad that Mr. McClellan went first because I want to associate myself with a number of his comments. I think he said a lot of important things. He was talking about prioritization there at the end. Is it the DCEI, Defense Critical Electric Infrastructure? Is it that one order, kind of one level down to some of the sort of societal needs, life, health, safety, first responders, things like that? NIAC, the President's National Infrastructure Advisory Council, recently did a report. I happen to be on the study group for catastrophic power outages. And I will say we have learned a lot from recent history, not just the storms that have impacted most of the United States or the wildfires out west or what happened in Puerto Rico, but now to bring back what you brought up about Ukraine, those are the supplemental operating strategies that we're talking about. What happened in Ukraine, I like to tell people, is my favorite kind of incident because it happened to somebody else, but we can learn from it. And we are. And so you're exactly right. One of the reasons that they were able to get back up and running as quickly as they were, so 225,000 people lost power for a few hours. It was a bad day to be sure, but it was not catastrophic to that country. They were able to go back to the good old pistol grip handles, and I like that, the human RTU. In order to have that human remote terminal unit, you need to be able to talk to that person in the field. You need a person in the field who is trained on what it is that they are going to be doing. Now, it may not be pretty. With the other joke we've had, it's not just supplemental operating strategies, it's the MacGyver project. How do we hold the grid together with bubble gum and duct tape in the event of a truly catastrophic incident? If you are, I'll give an example about sort of levels of magnitude for an incident. In Superstorm Sandy, there was a company that had storm walls for one of their key substations for 14-foot storm surge. The highest that had ever happened in that location was 10 feet. They were way above whatever a baseline storm would do. Superstorm Sandy was 16 feet of storm surge. So since then, they have not ripped out that substation and started something new. Instead, they've actually built some pretty creative, pretty low-tech solutions. They've got storm walls that one person can go in and shut. So I think what we have to do is not just rely exclusively on standards to the points that have been made. They do provide a great foundation, but also understand that that there are going to be incidents that strain our imaginations of what could happen. And again, this goes back to that left of boom versus right of boom. We should absolutely spend time and resources and effort to prepare, protect, detect, defend, exercise, but also to prepare to respond and recover. So,
listen, we should be looking for simple solutions. Take a look at after 9/11, the simplest solution, the most effective. We just hardened the cockpit doors, kind of like duh. The nuclear accident in Japan. Put cooling towers up on top. Okay? Don't rely on electrical pumps.
That's right.
So again, yes, absolutely. Don't look for some elegant, expensive solution. Look for the simplest solution as possible. Real quick before I go to Dr. Baker and Ms. Evans. Ms. Troop, I'd just like to ask your opinion of basically what Mr. McClendon was talking about on GMD, the surge protectors. I mean, easy, simple, boom, or not.
I'm not sure exactly the surge protector he's referred to. We use MOVs on our transmission system, and we're looking at very high-speed surge protection on the secondary for our relay protection. Problem is I've got 65,000 relays in my system, and about 60% of them are digital. And they've got about 30 or 40 points on the back of that relay. So if I had to put a surge protector across all of them, I got to make sure I don't short out something or open something that could create another consequence. So that's why we're trying to see, is there a simpler solution than putting one on every terminal point? And that's where we may need the labs to help us figure out what is the right answer to that. As far as the comment about electromechanical relays, there are areas in our network we can use them, and we're still using them. The suppliers are trying to get out of that business, so that'll be a problem for us down the road. So that's something also part of our strategy, but they can't be used everywhere on some of our EHV system because of stability concerns.
Well,
but that's some of the things we got to do.
There's one of the problems you have to solve is you have to maintain a supplier base, and that's maybe something you have to support if we view that as a mission critical or national security issue. Dr. Baker.
All right. Because EMP affects such large areas, you're talking about footprints that are 1,000+ miles in diameter. I think that we do need to have some standards or guidelines because the grid is so interconnected that if you don't have some uniform protection on the grid, if the protection is just sort of random, one part of the grid failing will pull down other parts of the grid, as we saw in 2003, where a small perturbation caused the entire large part of the Northeast. So I think standards are something that should be on the table, and we ought to think about that, just as we have the GMD benchmarks. The other point I would make is I think right now there's entirely too much emphasis on recovery. People are, the way I'm reading the tea leaves is people have this idea, we'll just let the grid fail, and then we'll just have elaborate recovery plans to be able to pick up the pieces afterwards. We need to protect as much and keep operating as much of the grid as possible so that we don't have to get into these modes where we're operating in the dark. We want to keep as much of the grid up as possible.
And I want to go to Ms. Durkovich because I know you have a timeline. You haven't spoken yet, so.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And I want to pull a string on something that Scott was talking about related to just lessons learned from other environmental hazards. And certainly the industry year after year gets better in both preparing for and responding to hurricanes. That's in part because there's been a very healthy dialogue around forecasting, right? In the sooner that industry can know about a storm, the sooner they start to take action. And from the moment that storm, that ingest becomes a named storm, things are done across the electric sector. I think that's an important part of the conversation, certainly that we had when we did the Space Weather Task Force, is really learning about what are the timeframes that industry needs to begin to take action. So I think that's an important conversation that needs to continue. One of the things that I think would be interesting, again, around preparedness, especially as we come to some conclusions about what are helpful mitigation measures, is each year FEMA hosts a annual hurricane briefing where they bring together all of the interagency, industry comes in. There's also a national hurricane conference. The goal of this is both to talk about what the hurricane season is going to look like. Do we expect it's going to be bad? Do we expect it's going to be good? We know a little bit something about the cycles of space weather, right, and where we are and what we can anticipate, and especially if we're in this if not when, in the 100-year storm window. But I also think that it would serve to both continue to raise awareness. You're sitting with people who think about this, who have leaned forward. There is a large part of industry and other industries, the mid to small size power providers that maybe don't have as much awareness or as much resources. And we need to continue to make sure that what David is learning at Dominion can be passed down to them, but that we can also learn from events where we do have near misses or mild storms, what worked, what didn't work, and continue to promulgate those among industry and academia. So I think it's a simple thing, but doing it on an annual basis continues to raise awareness about the risk. It's where we've got a problem. It brings people together to talk about what we know is working, what we can do better. And I think there's an element here that might also contribute to public awareness about this, which I will tell you is very low. I think you asked the average American. I will tell you, when I stepped into DHS and into my role as Assistant Secretary, I certainly did not know that space weather would be something that we would be dealing with.
Yeah, it's not why I ran for
Thank you,
the
if I
Senate
don't have an
president.
opportunity to provide comments again, for including me today in this important conversation.
Well, again, thank you for attending, and you raised a pretty interesting point. Kind of harkens back to some of the points that Dr. Baker made in his testimony. We're a lot, here in the federal government, we're talking about the top down. What do we need to do top down? But there's an awful lot of bottom up. And again, that's why I appreciate, the types of things that Dominion Electric is doing on its own, absent, better direction from the federal government. So again, thank you for coming, and really, safe travels home. Ms. Evans.
So I wanted to follow on exactly what Caitlin is saying is that I think I would offer a way to look at this is that there are a lot of lessons learned of what we do from a natural disaster type of prevention, pre-positioning resources in order to be able to do things. That is, my particular office is focused on energy security, right, as well as emergency response and cyber. So the whole idea is, what do we have to look at from a sector specific? How do we respond? And how do we pre-position? I think some of the things that Dr. Baker is looking at is that's after as we continuously do things, okay, this is the way the response works, this is how things are happening, this is the data associated with it, and it leads into we should have a minimum standard. I think several of these things are going on concurrently, and to go out on one versus the other, it all has to inform it. And I think that's really what, to Joe's point is like, we're doing these things concurrently. To leap right out and say, yeah, you have to have a standard, it is a long process, but it has to be informed by the practical exercises and activities that industry is doing now so that we know what the impact of that is going to be so that we can answer the question to you. So these are all going on concurrently, and it informs the standard process. So I know you want an action like, yeah, let's do a standard, but I think you want a standard that's informed that then can actually be able to say, yeah, we're prepared, we're pre-positioning, we work with industry, we're utilizing these things going forward, and this is how the nation is responding to the risk.
Again, what I'm looking for is, somebody mentioned the low-hanging fruit. Let's at least start doing the low-hanging fruit. As you're never going to have perfect information. So again, I'm looking. We've been doing this a long time, and again, I'll still say there's been minimal mitigation efforts that would really be effective, that are really protecting us here. We're still incredibly vulnerable to this, and I'm trying to reduce our vulnerability. I'm trying to take actions to start mitigating it so that there's some level of survivability. Mr. McClendon.
So I'm not sure my comment will help that perspective, but with your permission, I did want to make one clarification, and that was to the E1 mitigation that Mr. Roop commented on. E1 is not as easy. If there are electromechanical relays in place, E1 is and if you can leave those in place, then you've got a simple solution to leave those in place. And they're also, by the way, coincidentally, they're impervious to cyber attacks. So you sort of have a convergence of two threats there. But I do think that E1 is solvable if the universe is narrowed. So if it, and to the industry's point, if this is truly a national security matter and an important and urgent national security matter, and action needs to be taken, then the industry needs to be told that this is what needs to occur, and then the engagement has to begin, and if you want it done quickly, on a narrow subset And I would suggest that what the work that DOE's done, and to some degree DHS also, but that narrow subset should pick up to your earlier point on what are the best practices we're using with DOD, because we're rushing. And with haste, we're mitigating against EMP at those critical DOD facilities. Not going to do any good if they don't have service to the bases. So the point would be that's an area of focus that I think could be done quickly. It would be complex. I think to Dave's point, many of the relays, since the time I was in the industry, have become digital relays. And they're much more functional, and the grid is much more complex. But it can be done. And it can be done, I think, much more quickly on a narrow focus.
So yeah, let's face it, I think the IC will always assess that EMP is a very low probability event, and I would agree with that, okay? Let's hope so. So to a certain extent, I'm looking at not a full solution here, but are there common solutions that if you had an EMP attack and the grid was down, the same type of solutions, the same type of recovery systems would apply to cyber or GMD as well? So that's kind of where what are the common solutions here? What are the common mitigating factors we can do? I'm not looking for perfection here. I'm just looking to start taking some steps. Before we disband this, I do want to, because this is, as I read your testimony, Dr. Baker, one of the action items that really could, is very urgent is the whole issue about microgrids. I don't fully understand them, so I'd kind of like to have people respond a little bit to what Dr. Baker was talking about. Is there are more and more microgrids being established. It does increase the complexity of the grid. And if we don't, and the mitigation cost to military standards for E1, 2, and 3 and GMD is only 2 to 5% of construction costs. I mean, if all that is true, it would seem to me, if all that's required is the federal government better create a standard for microgrids to have them put that into the construction process, we ought to do that pretty fast. And I'd be looking to Senator Murkowski and my Senate colleagues to, raise the awareness and let's get at least this done. So I kind of want people's assessment of the whole microgrid issue. Okay, there you go. I actually saw you wiggle, so.
I knew I had to put the sign up. So a couple things about microgrids. I think people look at them as the answer to resilience. If only we had all this redundancy through microgrids. Well, the existing grid is effectively a grid of grids. That said, there is deployment of a lot of microgrids now. Some of the companies that are deploying them, non-utilities, are doing it on a very low margin to be cost competitive in a lot of places. So 2 to 5% matters a lot to them. We see that problem with cybersecurity as well. You're talking about very competitive technology space right now, adding complexity.
What is the cost of a microgrid? I mean, what's the cost range?
I'd have to ask one of these guys.
I mean, you're talking $100 million, you're talking about $5 million, what do you?
Well, I mean, it really depends on the application. There's a good example of what would be considered a microgrid that is jointly operated or that is operated by the Hawaiian Electric Company.
I'm an accountant, I'm a business guy. I understand, right, 2 to 5% could kill us. That's where I think the federal government could step in. If this was such an important issue,
right? If
this was so urgent, this could, this would be a blown opportunity, not putting the standard into those things. Fiscally conservative, I'll allocate the money because it's well worth it.
So the 2 to 5%, that's something. So if you're talking about a microgrid deployment on a military installation, that's good for the military installation for them to island themselves if necessary, or to support the surrounding community. And again, there's examples of that. One is particularly well known out in Hawaii. Schofield Barracks really built out a spectacular system. That's the kind of place where you would absolutely look at, and especially when you're talking about greenfield deployment. There are examples of some of our companies who are building new control centers, who are hardening some of their control houses as they build new substations. When you're talking about greenfield construction, adding 2 to 5%, that's worth every penny. When you're talking about retrofit, the costs go up tremendously. Exactly. That's right. With respect to microgrids, though, I think what we have to do is look at it in two ways. One is if it's a microgrid deployment in a critical facility supporting critical load, We need to think about all of the different ways that we would harden and protect against EMP, cyber, physical, et cetera. If you're talking about a more commercial application that doesn't have the same impact to life, health, and safety, well, they're going to try to be cost competitive in whichever way they can. So I'm sorry I don't know the hard numbers, but I do think you have to think about it from a cost effectiveness standpoint and where the deployment is. And then the last thing I'd say about microgrids is while they do add both resilience, because you have some redundancy, and complexity, you still need that backstop, the enabler of the broader grid, and that's where companies like Dominion and ATC and others come in.
Dr. Baker.
The microgrids are normally used on systems that are so critical that they can't stand outages from, they can't stand the 0.99 or 0.999 outage per, probability that you get with the rest of the grid. And so the services, the infrastructure services you would be protecting are going to be very, very critical. So that's another impetus for looking at these. The other point I would make that Scott echoed is you need to know not just EMP, but you need to look at cyber. They're talking about when they install microgrids, they are connecting the microgrid controls to the regular grid controls and the controls on other microgrids. So they call this aggregation. And just remember this: aggregation means aggravation in terms of vulnerability. So, but these things are proliferating to the point, and none of them are hard. I don't think they're either EMP or cyber hard, most of them. And so we need to get, that's a low hanging fruit for you.
You're talking to an accountant that had a PC with 5.5-inch floppy on my accounting system because I knew that would never get hacked.
Yeah.
Okay. I think since I've left, they've improved that, but I'm reasonably cautious about those things. Okay. Yeah, I'm kind of out of questions. I think we've gone far enough here. I do want to again apologize for kind of the clip nature of opening statements. I hope you found this informative. I hope you found it helpful. I certainly found it informative. What I would suggest, I want to give you a homework assignment if you choose to address it, because I did talk to Dr. Baker. And again, I valued all of your testimony. I truly did. I read all of it. It was very helpful. Dr. Baker, because of what he's done in military, he's actually been participating in a system in government that actually did this, hardened it. But also in his testimony throughout it, there were just like action items. And so I called him up. Can you lay those out as a priority? What I'd like all of you to do is make sure you have his testimony. I'd recommend you read it, but then look at his priorities. And you don't have to comment on all of it, but if you have a comment on his testimony or particular action items, if you disagree with it, let me know. Then we can try and figure out, where's the discrepancy there. Otherwise, what I will do is kind of view this as pretty authoritative and move forward based on that. So here's your chance to rip into old poor Dr. Baker and say, we just don't agree with this guy.
Man, you never explained that to me.
I've been doing this a long time, and the problem you have with EMP is you have people have been involved in this, and I think, and God bless them because they've been raising the alarm. Because they're raising the alarm, they may be viewed as alarmists, may be discounted. I'm not necessarily saying they should, but I think that's been part of the problem. I think on the other hand, you have industry that I don't blame you for not, there's not a spec here. I mean, we're going to do what we think is important. We're going to address, like, what is the high probability threats? I mean, we have enough things to worry about here versus addressing these low probability when government's really not giving us any direction. So, I'm not laying any blame here. I understand exactly kind of what the dynamic is here. There is, I believe, a moment in time here. I mean, I like the fact that Senator Toomey, after I presented this to our conference, is one of my top priorities. Again, he came up to me, hey, Ron, I really want to work with you on this. Senator Rounds, I've talked to Senator Inhofe and Senator Murkowski, chairman of both Armed Services and the Energy Committees. These are the committees where, the committee's jurisdiction or where there's a must-pass piece of legislation that maybe through the NDAA we can actually do some of the top-down legislation and act it into law. And I'll use the one example when I was interviewing Secretary Nielsen for position DHS. And she talked about CISA, and that took us too long, but we were kind of holding that, and I thought cooperatively so we could actually do full DHS reauthorization. But the other thing she talked about was the fact that we have no authority to mitigate against malign use of drones. And, well, I was shocked. What, are you kidding me? Fortunately, we had a video of an ISIS drone going over an Iraqi target, lowering itself, and then bombs away and pinpoint destroying an Iraqi target. Fortunately, I had that because I could show it in a committee, in a business meeting, and at Senate lunch, and I got people's attention. Not enough to get it through the NDAA, which I tried to do, but finally through the FAA. So there are ways of doing what I think needs to be done, but I would love to have everybody at this table in full agreement of what the action items certainly are. From a top-down approach, coming from the federal government, but then as a best practice through industry, the bottom up. I just met with the local utilities, the electrical co-ops. They obviously don't want over-regulation. I don't want to over-regulate them. But I certainly want to recognize this problem and utilize the federal government because we're the only entity that can really provide this kind of direction to create action. So, I mean, I could throw it open and say if anybody just has a burning desire to say something, and what I will say, I will. If you want to say a closing comment here, put your little thing up on, and you're going to get glares from your fellow panelists. But if anybody wants to say something, I'll let you. Otherwise, do your homework assignment, and please work with this committee at determining what action steps we should take. How can we codify it? Because these things, we'll have to enact this into law. But I think we've got some good partners, talking to Senator Mikowski, talking to Senator Inhofe, talking to the ranking members, talking to Senator Peters. We've got some people here that recognize this is an issue. And that hasn't always been the case. And I think we can actually do some good work here and help you improve your systems and keep this nation safe. So again, thank you all for your testimony, for putting up with me. And I look forward to working with you. It may not be vice versa, but let's work together and solve this problem. Okay, this business meeting is closed.